Around the country, we are hearing about statues being defaced, taken down, with bills being put forward in different legislatures and city councils to take down these statues and other emblems that have been placed all over our country, honoring people who, not just people on the Confederacy, but colonizers, explorers. I say that in quotations for those of you listening on podcast, and just very controversial figures. Our next guest is a friend. He is known in his district as Rabb. He's a representative for the 200th district in Pennsylvania, Chris Rabb. Also, prior to that, a well-known activist and writer. So even if you didn't know him from Pennsylvania, probably if you've been around for a while, you knew him from the other world of activism and writing and speaking out. Chris, representative, I should say. Thank you for joining the Nomiki show. I have to respect you.
Pleasure.
Yes.
It's a beautiful day.
It is. So, Philadelphia, where you represent, you represent the bluest dot, as you call it, in the state.
Yes.
You had the highest turnout with an election that just took place. You're tremendously popular, and you're an actual progressive. How can there be such a beautiful thing? But you've been at the forefront of so many pieces of legislation and activism when it comes to representing the Black community, fully and understanding like the legacy of the horrible legacy that we have in our country. So let's just start off with some of the bills that you've put forward, because I think this is really important to discuss before we get to the symbolism of taking down these statues.
Sure. Well, I thank you for having me on the show. I've been pretty busy. I was elected the same night as what's his name in 2016. I joined the smallest Democratic minority in the House of Representatives in 61 years. But within 2 years, we had a kind of a blue tsunami, and it looks like there's a chance that Democrats take back the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and potentially this House, the Senate as well. So that's good news. But in the interim, I'm working in a chamber dominated by right-wing extremists. So I've been busy working on things, all justice-oriented, whether it's environmental justice, racial justice, reproductive freedom, so forth. And in this moment, a lot of the bills that kind of languished are now getting more popularity and interest from my constituents and people around the state and around the country, most notably things around police violence. So I have a bill that would create a statewide database so that the police can't pass the trash from one police department to another. They go skulking out of one place before they get fired. They can end up somewhere else and do the same or worse harm in another community, unbeknownst not just to the people who they're supposed to protect and serve, but to the very chiefs of police who hire them, who don't know how bad they are. Yeah. This statewide database will protect everyone except those rogue cops. And that's an important thing, because we need that type of transparency and accountability that the Fraternal Order of Police and other apologists claim is not an issue, when in fact police violence has been built into the very notion of policing in this country since 1700 in Pennsylvania. So for 320 years, we have an institution of policing that was based on protecting the social order of white elites and their property. That's really the basis of policing as we know it in the North. And not much has changed in terms of what they protect. And most notably, there's some amazing pictures about them protecting a white racist former mayor of Philadelphia and former police commissioner. And he has this extraordinary statue in front of the municipal building in downtown Philly across from City Hall. And it was spray painted fascist. It was like fake blood put on it. It was all great stuff. The next day, it was whistle clean. It was shining like a beacon of white supremacy the next day, and a whole squadron of police officers protecting it.
This is Frank Rizzo?
That tells you, this is Frank Rizzo. This is the the infamous
Right.
police brutality, former mayor, former commissioner. So this tells you about what the priorities are of kind of modern police and historically. So if we're talking about toppling a 320-year institution that has not really changed that much in terms of what it actually does, then we have systemic change that we have to address. And it's not going to be happening by police reforms and just playing around the edges. We have to totally overhaul what we view as policing, and we have to put it in the context of what I call community safety. Because if it's not about community safety, that means that the old notion of protecting and serving is really narrow towards the people and the things that police care about most, which is the property rights of rich white people and the protecting white women and girls from the bad people, right? Mm-hmm. So if you look at Amy Cooper, right, she could feel comfortable calling and making things up. It didn't matter who the black person was. Right. Just the idea that there was a black man invading the space of a white woman automatically gave her power and affirmed the type of power that these police forces have. And we got to shut that down. If they're truly doing their job, then we're really talking about every community feeling as safe as the next one.
You know, you have a reparations bill that you've put forward. It's a state-based reparations bill, you know, getting to the heart of these systemic issues. Reparations have, I mean, if I could say it this way, it's become an idea that has become normalized in politics in so much that it's been put forward on the presidential platform as an idea.
Sort of.
This cycle as an idea.
Rhetorically, anyway.
Yes. But I'm saying it from, I think a lot of people outside of the activism world were starting to think about this in a deeper way. And I think it's really fascinating that you've put forward this bill and it's state-based. Could you describe what it represents and you know, what the significance of it would be in Pennsylvania in particular?
Well, so I think what people need to understand, because people are kind of like, if you do it on the state, then the federal government is not going to say, oh, our hands are clean because, you know, states are handling it. Not so. Everyone is culpable. Everyone is complicit. Every institution is touched by slavery and vice versa. But in Pennsylvania, it's important because a lot of people don't know or have forgotten that there was slavery in the North. That's including Pennsylvania colony founded by Quakers who are generally believed to be against slavery. Not so. We had gradual abolition that began in 1780, but the focus was on gradual. So there were enslaved black people in Pennsylvania for 75 years after that law was enacted. And there were many things that were built into state law and policy and the court system that specifically and explicitly excluded and marginalized black people for generations. And so even our outgoing Speaker of the House of Representatives on the House floor claimed he did not even know that slavery existed in his own state. And the fact that he could even admit this days before he resigned, someone who'd been in office for 20 years and did not know that there was slavery in Pennsylvania was utterly dumbfounding. And so these are people in positions of power. So when we talk about state-based reparations, we are acknowledging the fact that slavery was a state law. It was not a federal law. It was a state law. And every state dealt with slavery differently. So if you believe that slavery and all of the things that came after it, all the systemic racism that still remained after the abolition of slavery impacted Black communities and individuals on a transgenerational level, then you have to repair that damage. And if the government facilitated it through law, through appropriations, through all of these things, then what is that debt? What does that look like? Who is eligible? How are those programs created? Are there cash payments? Who is at the table to figure out what this looks like? So this is a complex process. The bill has not been formally introduced yet, but there's tremendous research that my team has begun to make sure that we do it right and use it as a blueprint for other states in the North, including, Nomi, New York.
Oh, shocker.
Where some of my favorite ancestors were enslaved in Manhattan. And there are a lot of Manhattanites who have no idea that, in fact, Manhattan was one of the largest slave
it was. That's why it existed. People don't even realize, the history of Manhattan, as opposed to other early cities in the colonies. Other cities were set for freedom of expression of religion, but it was the slave trade route. It was directly from the Caribbean to the port of Manhattan, and that is how banking evolved. So when people say, like, what do you mean economic oppression is racist? And it's like, well, it literally is the design. Capitalism, the design of capitalism, the electoral system is all based on that. So much so that the sin of Manhattan is slavery. And Wall Street.
And Wall Street. All of those things are connected. And the people who owned my people were connected with the Declaration of Independence. So my ninth great-grandfather was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. A very, it was the 1% of colonial America, the Livingstons, who were connected to the Roosevelts and the Bushes and so forth. And they owned hundreds of people in the Caribbean, in New York, and other places. And so this is personal to me as a genealogist and family historian, beyond just being a legislator. I've spent 25 years doing this research, and I'm connecting the dots and realizing how much of my personal story relates to policies that have impacted millions of people all over the country. So this is something I'm really looking forward to. I'm happy to update you about its progress, but things can happen. And the reason I was able to pass this bill of mine, this statewide police database, was because all the mass protests inspired a number of Black legislators, myself and others, to take over the House of Representatives. Literally, we shut it down. We commandeered the rostrum of the Speaker of the House, and we would not let them start session, which meant that our colleagues could not get a per diem, and that everything stopped. And we said, we're not going to give up the House floor until you push through substantive legislation that deals with police violence and police accountability. And within 90 minutes, we were at the negotiation table. Within a week, our bills got pushed out of the Judiciary Committee, and a week later, they ran unanimously through the House. Just yesterday, my bill left the House and is going to the Senate and should be on the governor's desk within a matter of days. And that is not because of me. That is because of the thousands and thousands of people across Pennsylvania and across the United States and the globe who are fighting for justice and demanding change. So for all those people who don't believe that protest amounts to anything, you're wrong. You're not on the streets. And if you are, then be affirmed that people are listening and following your leadership, because no serious social movement has ever been successful without mass protests. And that is what influences policy, not just the symbolism of monuments and statues, which are important, but ultimately we need to know that there's systemic change afoot because of the work we do on the ground floor.
So you mentioned that, and that's if you're watching mainstream media or have been listening to this debate over statues over the last, let's say last decade, just to keep it fresh.
Sure.
Much of it, you hear folks say, well, that shouldn't be our focus in the movement. That shouldn't be our focus. We should be focusing on these systemic issues. But, now you're seeing people warm up to it that probably weren't so. I've seen people's positions change just in the last few weeks on this. What really stood out to me in the argument was that so many of these statues were put up in the last 100 years. And I don't think I didn't know, I really didn't have any. I mean, obviously with Christopher Columbus, that's an obvious one that I didn't go up when he found, he discovered the Americas, quote unquote, discovered. But let's talk a little bit about that. Like, why did these statues get placed around this country, especially in places that, the North, for instance? Why are there Confederate statues in Pennsylvania?
Right, because, this is my, armchair, psychoanalyst of, what's going on here. I think it's people whose only kind of self-worth comes from whiteness. Like they feel threatened by the browning of America, by, the left having more influence, what have you, all these things. I think they feel they need to find something to hold on to. And for a lot of people who don't know their history, who don't have a lot of self-worth and don't have any substance behind their being, they grasp at anything that makes them feel better than others. And the one thing that so many people can feel that way about is being white, because if you're white, it makes you automatically better than everybody else. And it's a really sick pathology that is easily avoided if you just have decency and basic intellectual curiosity and people who actually don't all look like you. And it's much easier to kind of distance yourself from the mythology around whiteness. The whole Christopher Columbus thing is a joke, because any white person who's upset about it, who, even if they're Italian American, because the guy did this for Spain, number one. Right. He didn't discover anything. That's a fact. Right. And he never stepped on U.S. soil, modern U.S. soil. He didn't do any of those things. And he was just a real bastard, right? He was just a really awful human being. And if you're Italian American, you can't think of one person who represents your culture, who represents the best of this country and the old country, then you're just lazy, because there are a lot of folks to choose from. Any ethnic group in this country, whether you're Black or Jewish or Italian American or Greek American, you got to find at least one person that you're really proud of. And if you can't, then it is a farce. And I think for most people who are in Philadelphia and South Philly, who maybe right now are armed with bats, with golf clubs, with AR-15s, I don't know how many of those white people are actually Italian American. But they are angry white guys who feel threatened because they have little tiny egos and understanding of history. And, I don't know if we can help them. I don't have the energy to do that. Maybe other people can do that. But there is a growing percentage of white folk of all generations who are finally understanding that their fates are intertwined with that of Black and brown folk and indigenous folk. And that's part of the glimmer of hope I have. This is the first time I've seen that type of solidarity ever in the 50 years I've been on this planet. So that's good news. And the other thing is, symbolism matters. Symbolism matters. It is connected to the substance of what we believe. And if we feel that, these institutions are so powerful and these images are so ingrained that nothing can ever change that, and all of a sudden you see the most venerated things start to dissolve, you start to get hope that the institutions that built them up can dissolve too. And that is the type of progress we need to see, where that symbol is connected to substance. And we can and will make that happen, because we've done it before.
Yeah. There was an article in the New York Times, I believe it was today or yesterday, and in it they were talking about the statues, and Robert E. Lee Jr., or Robert E. Lee's great-grandson, I believe, was referenced in this piece, saying, when he was a kid, he would walk by the statue of his great-grandfather, or great-great-grandfather, I guess you could say, and felt like, that's kind of cool. It's like my name. And then he has a nice little feeling. And then over time, as he became educated, it felt a little uncomfortable, and he didn't know. And it's the same name. He lives with that name too. But then it wasn't until he saw a decade ago or so, he saw armed white nationalists protecting the statue, that he came out publicly and said that statue needs to go down. So,
well, I got to tell you, that guy is my cousin, because Robert E. Lee's father is one of my ancestors. So some of my ancestors are some of the worst white supremacist rapists you could ever imagine. And when I found out about my history doing genealogy when I was in my 20s, shortly after I graduated from college, it was painful to try to find out, to track the footprints of my African ancestors and keep bumping into the people who raped them. Yeah. And that is so much a part of this culture. When we talk about patriarchy, when we talk about violence, it is part and parcel of what it means to be an American. And that's not something we should be proud of. Right. And we have to disassemble these myths and narratives and symbols and substance to get at what we truly want to embrace to find any greatness, any potential in this country, because we've never achieved it. We've never been anywhere close to it, but we have the possibility only if we work together and we look at these ugly truths and we find beauty by saying, we're not going to pretend it doesn't exist. We're going to learn from it. We're going to learn from it together. And that's a radical thing to do. It's really never been done. The best example I can come up with is abolitionism, because that was multi-ethnic, multi-faith. It was all kinds of folks. And I think we can learn a lot from the abolitionist movement and apply it to modern day times. And I think there's a lot of hope we can have. And I'm not an optimist by nature. I am a student of history. And it's because of that study of history that I feel that we should be affirmed in what we're seeing on the streets and how these mass protests are substantively impacting policies that can move us towards systemic change. The elites do not want to let us believe that we can topple things that seem intractable, seem intransigent, when in fact we absolutely can, because we've done it before.
Chris, you're brilliant. We need more Chris's elected. Oh, I'm so jealous. I'm so jealous that, you're representing Philadelphia. Can you come up to New York when you're done and run for governor?
See if I can annex Queens.
Exactly, be great. Where our governor decided that it was the time to, talk about, not even present a police reform bill. Our Democratic governor, who also thinks, Columbus should be protected because he's a good Italian man. That's Governor Cuomo.
Right.
So you want to talk to your family members about how Governor Cuomo ain't that great. There's a lot of reasons. That's the question. That's the one of today. Representative Rabb, thank you. Rep Rabb, for doing this great work. And we'd love to have you on when those bills pass. And, you're making history, and, you've got a great district too. I mean, you're clearly inspiring voters. If you have the highest voter turnout in the state, they see what we see.
I'm a fortunate man. What can I say?